What's up? Welcome back to another edition of the Seats to Streets podcast. I am your host, J.R. Horn, and over there we've got Brian Gorman, lead minister at First Christian Church in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We are glad you are here with us. And if you were here with us last time, you got to hear a little bit about Brian's story about going and punching and kicking some staff. Give it be for a little bit. Let it simmer. Let that crock pot. If you don't know what that's about, you've got to go listen to the last episode or the last few episodes because you need to understand what that is. Brian's an avid MMA junkie and trains at the local UFC gym in town. So we always
I just got a picture yesterday, actually, just like an hour, maybe hour and a half ago. Today in my world is Thursday. On Monday.
Well, hey, guess what? It's Thursday in my world too.
Well, I wasn't sure
what world are you in?
On Monday,
I have had to remind you of what day it is before.
It's been known to occur. Actually, I got my wife had to remind me of something at like 9:58 today. She's like, "Don't you have to be at this place at 10?" Yes, I do. And so, but on Monday, I had a partner, a guy I went with. We were doing all of our stuff, and he's holding pads, right? So it's not just like it's a pad based class. So he's got these big, thick kick pads and punching pads and all this stuff. And today he sent me a picture with his arms up, and he shows me on one of his arms this giant bruise where my kicks went through the pad enough to bruise his forearm through the pads. And
the pad.
Boom! That is so. I'm sorry.
It's like being the catcher, and you come out and it's just black and blue right
it's like,
here.
Man, you got to catch the right spot. But evidently, I caught him clean.
That was one of the reasons why I quit playing softball up there. When Don would fire those balls over to first base, bro, I'd get out of the way. I'm like, I'm gonna let the fence catch it.
Yeah.
We had a guy on our softball team, on our church softball team, that had an absolute rocket of an arm. He
played semi-pro.
Yeah, he played some ball and would just rocket at you and would smile at you the whole time because you knew what you were about to get. I was new. I didn't know what I was doing. Stood here like this and, man, caught one in the meat. Oh, my goodness. And he just cackled. So after that, I'm like, hey, I'm at first base. I'm gonna let the fence catch it. Because it's going to get here fast enough for me to get to the fence and get back because I'm not doing it.
Yeah. So it was a fun day. I didn't realize I was doing that kind of damage to him. I know he was saying I was kicking hard, but I guess I was. This is a lot of weight to put behind a kick, but I thought it was like exciting when he sent the picture today, and you could just see this giant spot on his forearm. Like, yay me!
We celebrated birthdays yesterday. I got two kids that are born in within 3 days of each other in September. Now they're 6 years apart, but one's on September 25th, one's on September 28th. So, which is when we're about recording this episode. And I got to, we've been able to, so far, one's 6, one's 12, we've been able to convince them to have combined birthday parties, which is for now fantastic on the budget. That's going to change. This might be the last year. So we convinced them that our gift to them was going to be throwing a party. We're going to go to a place called Altitude, which is indoor trampoline park. And we got to be able to go there for several hours and cupcakes and all this stuff. Get this, my oldest kid doesn't like cake, but he loves cupcakes.
Okay.
I have no clue. We had another debate on the way in. I'm like, dude, you wanted cupcakes again for your birthday?
It is
cake.
It's
cake
cup
in a round form. Yeah, but I don't like cake.
Yeah. Okay then.
Oh, all right.
I wonder if he's like his dad, and he would be just more than happy with a giant cup of icing, if that may be more of his.
Right here on my shelf.
Yeah.
Right here. Let it sit.
Yeah.
So we got to go to the trampoline park, and you want to talk about walking away with bruises? I made the good choice of not going and jumping on the trampolines. I'm not doing it. Had 2 back surgeries. I'm a big boy, ain't doing it. So I stood out there and I held purses and I watched the cupcakes. My wife, on the other hand, put on the jumpy socks and went out. And she decided to challenge all the birthday kids. We practically had the place to ourselves. There was only like 20 people in there. It was fantastic. Challenge them to race all the way down the long, trampoline part, where there's multiple trampolines, like 10 trampolines in a row. You can just bounce and bounce and bounce and bounce.
Right.
So she challenged them to race all the way down. The race down was great. The race back, not so much. One little misstep, and she Supermaned across one 10-foot trampoline and just burnt both elbows up. So she woke up this morning and they were a nice, pale pink, where you've just took the hide right off. Oh my goodness! But
I have a 15-year-old as of today. It is her birthday today.
Whoa! Happy birthday!
Yep. So
any special plans?
Yeah, we're gonna have sushi for dinner.
Are you making it?
No.
Okay.
Not this time.
Okay.
Like I thought about it, but nope, we're not doing that this time.
All right.
But one of my daughters made cupcakes or something. I don't know. I'm along for the ride in a lot of ways, and it's a weekday, and everybody's got things to do and places to be. So we're just gonna do it. But she wanted sushi, so we're having sushi.
I'm just saying, if your wife was making the cake, I'd drive up for that.
No, I can't handle it. That's just waiting to get diabetes.
Diabetes. 2 words for you. Diabetes.
So what are we doing, JR? What's the plan?
Well, the last time we were on here talking in our podcast episode, we ended it talking about letting people know that we've got a 4-part series come up on the C word, culture. What does it look like to have what does it look like to identify the culture in your church? You all have one. What does it look like to change it? Is it good? Is it bad? Everything about culture. And so what we want to do is to spend the next 4 podcast episodes talking about culture. So every church has a culture, and it can be seen, in my opinion, in one of 2 ways. Every pastor that I've ever met walks in with this deep desire for people to know Jesus and to follow the teachings of Jesus. So to know Jesus and to put it into action. Disciples who make disciples. And when you're trying to figure out what a culture looks like, you can see this desire in a pastor's heart show in a couple ways. One is when someone finally gets it. There's this aha moment of, oh, I know who Jesus is. Historically, spiritually, I know who Jesus is, and I want to follow him, and I want to go and teach other people about it. That's one of the ways we see this deep desire, this propelling into the ministry. But another way, Brian, is also when we see this desire in pastors' hearts is when we've both been there and walking into an office, slamming the door, turn the lights down, flopping down into our office chair and going, why am I here? Like, am I even making a difference? And what we found out is there is a way for your culture of your church and your staff to either be the biggest engine driving you making disciples, or the biggest roadblock in the middle of the tracks that doesn't let the train move. Culture is that big of a deal.
It's that big of a deal, but it's also it's one of those things we're aware of, but we're not, right? You and I have used different phrases for this. Like my phrase is, you don't ask a fish about the water, right? You don't recognize it because it's not as visible as so many other elements that go on. And yet you have a culture, your church, your mission team, your benevolence team, your organization, your family, your hobbies. There is a culture there. And the reality of culture is it is either going to exist intentionally or unintentionally. And one of the great opportunities we get as leaders is to build intentionality into it. But when you look at your organization and you're like, you talked about, if you find that the people in your church are always inviting other people to come to your church, then there is a culture where that's coming true. If you find that your people talk about loving Jesus and talk about wanting people to know Jesus, but don't invite their friends, right? Then that's telling you something about the culture, that the culture isn't there. And oftentimes what happens is ministers, we take this on ourselves, or team leads, we take this on ourselves and go, oh, they must not like my teaching, or they must not like the music, or they must not like the way the meetings are run or what we're doing. And the reality is that's generally not true. People will stay a part of your organization for a long time, even if they don't really engage deeply with what you're doing, as long as they engage with the culture. And so that's why that's so important for us to look at, and why it's going to take us a few weeks to really map out what it is, how do we find it, how do we build it, and how do we maintain it. That's going to be kind of the components here.
Now, what we've seen also, Brian, is that when we've had conversations with church leaders on when they come to a point and go, oh, I understand what culture is now. I understand that it's something that we do or don't do, right? Same thing like sin. Sin is doesn't have to be something that we do. It's a sin of omission or not saying something. So if this idea for culture is the same way, and we've had a pastor that said, hey, I understand that now. There's often a lack of fully comprehending what this is and how powerful it is, because we were never taught this in seminary.
Right.
There was never a class that says, hey, here's how to make a disciple-making culture on your staff and in your church. Because, Brian, we both know there's a culture of the church as in the building, but there's also a culture of the individual offices down the hallway. And we're never taught to how to find it, survey it, observe it, see where we need to improve, see the things we take away, even the culture moments. We've never been taught that. So that's really why we're doing this. That's why Brian and I want to do this at Seats the Streets, to be able to give you these tools to create a disciple-making culture, but also to move your people from Sunday morning seats to local and global streets. That's it. That's our heart, is we want to give these tools to you so that you can make a kingdom impact.
So to understand this, we need to, real quick, what I want to do is I want to lay out for you 3 things that we think are culture, but are not as important as we believe. And then the 4 things that actually make up a culture. But we got to deal with the 3 things that are not, because it's the first place we tend to look. Right. The first things we tend to look at is we tend to think people, that people make the culture. The people are a part of a culture. The fish was added to the aquarium. That fish is going to impact the culture, but the people aren't really the most key element. They are how culture is lived out. They're indicators, but they're not the creation of it. Sometimes people think, well, the attitude of the people, the attitude of the organization, and attitude is great, but there's nothing you can control in that, right? One of the things we talk about when it comes to church management is I don't get to determine your intent. I get to speak into your behavior. I can't say what you meant to do or didn't mean to do. I can say, here's the behavior, right? So attitudes are really out of our control. I don't get to determine whether my kids agree with cleaning their room or not. I do get to speak into whether they clean their room or not.
I want you to want to do the dishes, Brian.
Nobody wants to do the dishes. And then the third component that is not, but oftentimes is believed, is goals. Sometimes people think, oh, if we have better goals, we'll have a better culture. No, you won't. You'll just have different goals. You'll still be fighting your culture or being drug along by your culture to get to them. So I'm putting that. I want you to take those ideas. I want you to put them off to the side. They will matter, but not so much for this. Instead, I want to give you the 4 components that really make up the culture.
Hang on, Brian.
Okay.
You bring up those 3 things that, as far as what we think defines the culture.
Right.
Why do you think that us as pastors, we've done it? We're not saying this is coming on high and telling you what you're supposed to do. No, we've done this. We've got it wrong. We figured it out, and now we want to give it to you. Why do we run to those 3 things so easily? I mean, every time we run to, this person doesn't jive. They're not the right person. We got to get somebody else in there. And why do we run to those 3 things over and over and over and over again?
I think it comes down to, I think all 3 of them are based around 3 specific issues. We run to people because we want someone to blame that's not us. We run to, and man, I'm sounding dark all of a sudden, but we run to attitudes because we feel victim. Like there's nothing we can do about it. It's just the way these people feel. So that one allows us to be passive in it. And then we run to goals thinking, well, maybe if I really, pick myself up by my bootstraps, which is you drown if you do that, right? But we want to think, maybe if I can control it, if I control the goal. And so it comes down to, we want someone to blame, we want to be the victim, or we want to control. And that's the problem with those 3 things is, if that's where you go, you're really not recognizing that even when that person leaves and you bring the next person in, problem will still exist. If you give up because attitudes are attitudes, problem will still exist. You build goals, but you don't address the culture, the engine that's making those things come to fruition, then at that point, you're still going to be frustrated on the other side. You're going to get your goals done, but still be unhealthy potentially. And so that's why we run to those 3, I would argue.
Yeah, and the hard part is that the average minister doesn't stay at a church long enough to see the historical repeating of that over and over and over again. We're still averaging 3 to 5 years for lead ministers.
Right.
So a pastor is not staying long enough to see that repeat. The elders do. The elders will see that over and over and over again. And if someone is able to help them stand back and look to say, hey, you've had different lead ministers, different youth ministers, different worship ministers, different whoever, and you've still had the same problems, then it's bigger than that. It's something that controls the people. It controls their attitude and it controls the goals. Because
Right.
if you change the underlying, it's not going to change what's actually an issue, which is an unhealthy culture at
Yeah.
the church.
And ministers get this.
Yeah.
Mission team leaders get this, right? Minister, if you're going into an elders meeting, right, and you know that over the course of your time there, you've had 5, 6 different elders, and yet the same issue still persists, that's cultural.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been working with your mission team and you've changed people in and out, and there's been transition, but the same issue keeps existing, that's cultural.
Yes.
I'm saying that because it took me a long time to recognize that in mind when I went, oh, wait a minute, there is a cultural problem no matter who we bring onto this team, high capacity, low capacity, pastoral, driven, whatever, we had the same problem. So once we were able to stop and go, wait a minute, there is a cultural issue that has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
We were able to have a much different thing. So let me lay out for you 4 things to be watching that really make up culture. I'm just going to lay them out for you real quick, and then we'll talk about them a little bit. The 4 elements are your language or your vocabulary or your words, whatever term you feel comfortable using, but the language that you use, the behaviors you can observe, different than attitudes, the behaviors you can observe, like I specifically see this thing, the systems that you have in place, what are the results for doing the things you do, and the values that run within the organization. Values will be the toughest one, but you have your language, your behaviors, your systems, and your values. Those are the 4 components that make up the culture that you're swimming in. So let's just kind of tear these apart a little bit. We'll just kind of move them quickly today, and then over the next few weeks, we'll kind of go into a little bit more what to do with them. When we talk about language, what we're referring to are the words that or phrases that your organization uses that may be intentional or unintentional, but they are there. So, for example, if you're in a church that uses the word saved over and over and over again, or sanctified over and over and over again, like maybe that's a word that shows up, you're making a statement about what sort of church background your people should have to really fit in to speak that language. A while back, I had a guy I was talking to, and I asked him, what do you do for a living? And he began to go into this global conglomerate of pipelines and all this stuff. And it's like, I'm thinking one of 2 things. Either one, he doesn't have a clue who he's talking to.
Right.
Because everyone's like, what kind of pipes are you smoking?
Right.
Or the other thing is that he doesn't know what he does well enough to be able to condense and explain it. The language matters in a huge way. And so finding the right words that gives your people a common speech, a way of referring to things, a way of talking about things, that by itself can make this dramatic impact in your culture, the language you use.
Right. It really is. It does come down to the verbiage that comes out of our mouth. I mean, think about it. It's the one thing that either we've talked about magnetism before, that magnets do 2 things. They attract and they repel. Your words will attract those that either want to know more or that synthesize with those words, or it repels those who are like, nope, that's not what I want, or that's not what I need. So our language really does set the tone as far as how we're establishing this disciple-making culture. A while back, Barna released a study about the drastic number of percentage of individuals who had, when asked, do you know what the Great Commission is? And it was like, really low. Well, that could just be a semantic issue.
Yeah.
That could just be that the fact that you're not in a predominantly Bible Belt community and you're not using the words Great Commission, because if somebody not from the Bible Belt community comes in off the street, has no church background at all, and use the words Great Commission, they're looking around like, does anybody else know what that means? It could just be because we're saying, hey, Matthew 28 says, well, I don't know what Matthew 28 says because you've talked about it from the stage several times. It says to go and make disciples. Our language really does hold that much weight.
So let me give you a real practical side on this. Right, if you're the leader, I carry notebooks with me everywhere I go, or your planner, or use your phone, whatever. But what I would encourage you to do is,
I got my new one in. Look at that.
Yay! I like them.
Uh-huh.
But what I encourage you to do is, as you sit in different meetings, different appointments, keep that notebook there. And every time you start to recognize, oh, wait a minute, I've heard that word or that phrase before, write it down. The other thing I'd recommend you do, and something I did a while back, is I had a couple people in my church who pay a lot of attention to this. And I said, I'd like you to keep a running list of the phrases I repeat, some that I'm aware of, some I'm not aware of. And from that, I had this long list of the words others were using, the words I was using. Were they meshing? Were they connecting? What are they saying? How are we hearing them? And so by bringing in some outside opinions into that, it really helps.
Mm-hmm.
So pay attention to your language. So that brings us to that one. Let's talk about the second issue, the behaviors. Now, as I already said, this is a little bonus for those of you who oversee a staff, and who oversee volunteers. You don't get to manage intent. I can't say, oh, well, you mean to be late. Well, I don't know what they mean to do. I just know they're late. Or you did that just to hurt me. I don't get to speak as to whether or not they did or not. I know what the behavior was, and I know I was hurt. But I don't get to speak to intent because I can't manage intent. I can manage behavior. Behavior is something I can control. And so what you want to look for are, what are the patterns of behavior? Because the patterns of behavior play into the culture. If you find that 3 out of 4 people come to your meetings late, then that means culturally it's acceptable to be at the meetings late.
Totally fine.
If you find, I remember I was going to go to a church here in town one day. I had a Sunday off. I was going to go to another church, and I was asking some people from that church, hey, what do I need to know? And one of the things they said, like almost every person said, was, hey, make sure you're there about 10 minutes early. I was like, okay, why? Because most churches I go to, they're like 20 minutes late, right? Why 10 minutes early? And they went, oh, because there aren't that many seats available. It's a very full room, and if you aren't there early, you won't get a seat. The church then added another service, and yet the culture of being 10 minutes early stayed.
Wow.
Because they created the culture of being 10 minutes early. And as a result, the church actually sort of programmed another behavior and another system we'll get to for that culture to encourage them to say there's a reward for being here earlier. But ultimately, the behavior of being early was a key factor. So the behaviors begin to play out in a huge way.
In my opinion, behavior is just as impactful as our language. The old saying, we can't walk the walk and talk the talk. It's very much kind of that same thing. Are your actions going to back up what your language does? And so our behavior really does play into that. If we're a lead pastor and we're standing on stage and we're asking our people to do something and we're not willing to enter into do that with them, then our behavior is basically saying, don't really listen to what I say. That's a tough place to be in. When we want our people to be disciple makers, well, then are you making disciples? What does that look like for you? But even then, other behaviors as well, like you just said, Brian. Staff walking in 3 to 4 minutes late, especially with a Starbucks cup in their hand, and like, oh, traffic was terrible. Like, no, that's a cultural indicator that I just lied to you. And traffic wasn't terrible because I just went to go to Starbucks. The behavior of not coming back to that person and saying, hey, that's, you're holding us up and you're being disrespectful to all the other people that got here on time. The behaviors are insanely needed. Case in point, I was attending a church in our move from Wisconsin to Louisville, and we were church shopping and trying to see where God's calling us to be, to locate to a church. And I remember getting to a church, and the worship minister hops on stage. I'm thinking, hey, everything's going good. They're getting up stage about 2 minutes beforehand. Everybody gets their instruments, and the worship minister leans into the microphone and says, hey, we're going to go ahead and start early a little bit. There was 1 minute and 36 seconds left on the clock. I could see it in my brain.
They had a countdown clock, and they still
clock. We're going to start early. Now, on the surface, that's not a big deal. Right? They're early. Okay, we'll just start everything going. But what that tells everyone else is shapes the culture, because that person told all the volunteers, hey, your prep doesn't matter. You got to be willing to wait for my call. And I say we start now. That means the sound guy who was finishing up, topping off his coffee before he got to the sound booth is not there to unmute anything. So that people are going to pick up on that and say, well, aren't people ready around here?
Yeah.
Man, our
my wife's home
behaviors.
church.
Yeah.
where she came from, it didn't matter what time service started. Service started when all of the elders who were standing out front by the sign put their cigarettes out. Now church can start. And that's where she came from. And so, but think about, so same thing we did with language, do the same thing with your behaviors. Ask yourself, does my staff, do they smile at each other when they see each other? Do they say good morning? When they come in, do they immediately pull their phones out, or do they engage with one another? All of these are part of those behaviors.
Do they hang out outside of work hours?
Yeah. And I'm going to piggyback on something you said there a minute ago, because I think it's really key. I hear a handful of ministers, this is where Brian's going to be a bit more forceful. I hear a lot of ministers talk about, they wish their people were more evangelistic, or they told more people about Jesus, or they invited more people about Jesus or to church. And my first question is, who was the last person you led to Jesus that you did not meet because you were at the church? And if you don't have someone in the last couple of years, man, there needs to be some serious soul searching. I make it a personal, this is just me, I make it a personal goal of mine every single year that I need to show someone who had no relationship with Jesus or his church, who now has a consistent relationship with Jesus and the church, but because I met them outside of church. Not because they were introduced to me, because they came with a friend. Like, I got them, went to them. So behaviors. So the third issue that we got to look at is, you want to look at your systems. Your systems are ultimately what gets rewarded, what gets punished, and what is the results of specific behaviors, because that's really what a system is. It is the result, or the expected result and desired result, of a specific behavior. So this would be an example of a behavior with a system. Is if you want people to know that they matter, if you want like a team environment, right? Let's say your team culture isn't quite working very well. And what you start to notice is, when I send a text to someone on my team, or in our setting, like we talked about last time with the tech stack, if I send a base camp ping to one of my staff and it takes 3 days to get a response on that, you know what? If that happens once, it happens once. But if I start finding every time we're trying to communicate through that format, it's taken me a long time to hear back from them. We have a cultural problem, and we will establish a system to improve that problem. So we would create some results that would go along with we will respond within such and such a time, like the clock starts now.
And that's a value statement that we're going to talk about next too. Yeah,
it is. And so, that's why all this plays out together to make culture. But you have these systems. You have systems for, hey, if the countdown's over at 0.00, then you don't start at 1:30. You start at 0.00, right? This is when you go. And so it's creating these systems and saying, this is a definition of the expected behavior. And here's the kicker: if those systems are not met, if those expectations are not met, there will be either rewards or punishments, discipline based around, there's going to be positive feedback or adjusting feedback based around that. So finding those systems that you have in place, asking yourself ultimately, what are the place to start is finding what the systems are to begin with. What are the things that you can predict? If you can predict everybody showing up late, okay, we're learning something here. What systems can be implemented to make that adjustment? If you can predict that you've got this staff and this staff that just don't like each other, but it really didn't matter who the staff is, there's always staff that just don't like each other. There's a culture there somehow. And so there are some systems that can be implemented, and systems that are implemented to create that. In our setting, we've got some staff who have to be in the building, and some staff who have a lot of freedom in their office hours. If you're not careful, that behavior, if not set up with defined systems, can create a lot of animosity between the two.
Yeah, especially full-time salaried employees versus hourly employees. Contract versus a salary. I mean, there is a fine line to walk to some point that doesn't negatively impact the staff culture, for sure. So I mean, systems is probably one of the most hated or pushed back terms when it comes to church world, because processes, system, that's business, and we don't need anything more than that. When really we all have them. They're there. They're all there. We just call them something different, or we just look over them and try to play like they're not there. But we all have
we put
systems
them in place and we don't follow through on them. And I think that's one of the biggest ones in churches. Like, what we should do, but there's not an actual result. There's not there's enough feedback based upon the success of it.
So here's one of the systems that one of the churches that I was involved with, they put into place. They noticed that everybody's coming in at like sporadic hours, a lot of salary staff, very low hourly or contract staff, and they realized that a lot of our people are coming in at sporadic hours. But it's really hard to get a hold of someone and to get an answer right now, especially when you're planning a service or you're planning an event. Something comes up and you've got to do something. It's great to be able to walk down the hall and to be able to go, hey, I've got this problem. Can we adjust this or whatever? And so what they've decided to do is in order to create a moment so that the staff has continued to be together and that they can hear what is going on throughout the week to champion and to aid, they've created a 9 o'clock standing meeting Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. That if you're salaried, if you're a full-time salaried individual, we'd like to see you at 9 a.m. on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in the building. I think it's from like, and they even said, please stick around from like 9 to noon. That's their office hours. Which 9 to noon office hours, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, that's a breeze. That's awesome.
Pretty good gig.
So 9 o'clock. Standing meetings. Say, hey, what's going on? Let's pray as a staff. Let's all see each other and let's champion what's going on in each one of our worlds.
Right.
So that's a system. That was a system that they put into place. And so guess what? Now everybody's in at 9 o'clock. And even the part-time staff are like, hey, I'd like to be at that meeting. It's pretty cool. So even the part-time staff is even showing up at 9 o'clock too. That's a system. And so don't push back too much on it, because we all have them, and that's we need to implement them, and we also need to take some systems away that maybe you have on staff that are absolutely detrimental to your staff culture. So don't push back on systems.
Your systems are creating that culture.
Yes.
Your systems are absolutely playing into the culture, whether they're intentionally planned systems or unintentional systems that are in place. It's there. So let's deal with the fourth one, and we're going to deal with this one a little quickly but it is the hardest one to grasp, and that's the values. It's so tough because values are a little hard to define, although we know them when we experience them, right? We know that some organizations have a value of innovation, or a value of teamwork, or a value of autonomy, or a value of individualism, or a value of freedom, a value of structure. A value of fun. These values exist, and these are those things that are amazingly visible and at the same time really hard to see. Like, you know them, you just don't know that you know them. So this is really a challenge, because the challenge is, especially as you try to find these, is what we often do is we go, here's the values we wish we had, aspirational values. But what you need to discover, what are your actual values? What do you really do? When you look at who your church is, how your teams function, right? The values that are there, which play into the systems, play into the behaviors, play into the speech, all these work out together. Those values are really the current that runs underneath your culture. If you have a value of promptness or a value of team cohesion, all that's going to play out that way. If you have a value of efficiency, you may not realize that you do or not, but I know some organizations that value efficiency, and so their meetings are extremely efficient. They're just horribly ineffective. They don't move anything forward, but we were done on time. So it's finding those things, because your values will ultimately be the thing that create the undercurrent for everything else that you're doing. And so we're going to walk through next time some specific ways to begin to flesh out these values, so you'll start to go, oh, that's why we keep doing that.
Right.
And I'm saying that as someone who, in our church, we have these values mapped out, and here just in the last few months, we went back and said, let's make sure that those are accurate. And we put a team of people together and have really been pouring through, starting from scratch to go, who are we today? Because who we were 2 years ago, who we think we are, and who we really are may not be the same thing. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board all the way from the beginning and started remapping our values, so that we can clarify who we are. Values are key.
So values are key, and when you get to the level to where you can actually put those value statements like you just talked about, right? Like you've got value statements at your church, but maybe a value statement using language, going back to the language and upholding our values. Maybe there's a value that our church, when you finally get to where you identify the positive values of your culture and you're going to putting them in, maybe they'll sound something like, we value people over processes.
Mm-hmm.
Now hang on. That's not a contradicting statement to systems. Right. So
Right.
here's what valuing people over processes look like. And when you start to say this to your staff, when you start to say this to your volunteers, look, if you're a missions minister and you've got a missions team, if you're a youth pastor listening and you've got a youth volunteer team, same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same processes for you of giving down into your volunteers. Valuing people over processes looks like this. Many years ago, I was leading a mission trip to go overseas. And it was at our church. It was one of the like 201 trips, like 101 in the country, 201 out of the country, maybe like Central America, Puerto Rico, 301 later on out. That's a system, right? Because I want to make sure that I'm not taking a brand new Christian and taking them to India and then losing it. So process to be a part of that trip was you had to come to our meetings. So I can teach you how to fundraise, and I can teach you how to be a good guest when we go out of our country and into someone else's country. Mm-hmm. I had one of my students come to me at the very end. We had like 30 days left before the trip, and they say, I want to go on this. Now, I had been training these students for 6 months, and this one comes and says, I really want to go on this. Well, my process is I need to train you on all of these things so that you can be successful. But I valued people over processes. And I said, you know what? Because of your intent, your desire, your background, and some of the things that we can do before we go, I'm going to let you go on this trip. And you know what happened, Brian? That's the trip. One of my students became a missionary. And that student on that trip, if I didn't value people over processes and I had a cultural value of that, I would have just looked and said, hey, man, you're not going to be able to make the trainings. You're not going to raise the funds in time because I can't train you. I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to go. But we valued people
over process, not people not process.
Exactly.
And so you adjust the process accordingly. And this is why if you're in a church that claims, okay, let's just play around in reality. I think a lot of us at one point or another walk into a church that's one I use all the time. That claims we want to see people come to know Jesus.
Yep.
And yet, the moment you try to make a change to really accommodate those people who don't know Jesus, when the core of the church or the leadership of the church pushes back and goes, we're not going to make that change, you actually just learned the value.
Yep. Like taking pews out and putting chairs in.
Right.
My goodness.
You may have learned the value.
Absolutely.
But by the same token, we all know I've seen churches try to do put the drum kit and put the band in, but they didn't have anybody can play them, and all of a sudden you thought that was going to be the thing that fixed it, and it was not. What really would have changed your church was culture, not just the program or not just the system, and that's why your language, your behaviors, your systems, and your values all work hand in hand. And ultimately what we have here is the recognition, this is what we're going to deal with next time, is this recognition that the word that we use for culture stems from the same root word that we use for cultivate. That your culture, if you leave it unattended, you will end up with a giant field that may be able to grow something, but is also going to be filled with weeds.
Right.
But if you cultivate it well, you'll actually grow the fruit and grow the crop that God has specifically designed and intended your church to be able to grow well. Because we have all of these churches all around us, and each one of them have the capacity to reach specific types of people. You want to make sure that what you're doing has intentionality to it, which is why we cultivate our culture. And that's why we're going to learn how to build it, how to maintain it, how to understand it. That'll be the next few times we meet.
Yep. Well, we're going to cut this off because we've held you long enough, and we are so thankful that you have tuned in. If you haven't yet, please like, comment, and subscribe below. We would love to be able to make sure that you know every time we publish a video like this that it dings your YouTube app or even sends you an email, whatever that subscription looks like for you. So we're happy to have you here. The next few weeks, we're going to talk about this cultural word, and we're going to be able to bring that in. But Brian, you and I both know in the last 40 or so minutes, we really unpacked 6 months to 2 years worth of work that must be done in order to do this. And we're not saying that it's daunting. We're saying it's exciting.
You're not walking into one meeting and calling it a cultural day.
No, this is something that you get to cultivate and to grow and to nurture and to watch it bloom. So we know that just by taking the 4 things that we've laid out today and you trying to implement that like tomorrow is going to be detrimental. You're going to hurt the culture. So here's what we'd like to do. We'd love to be a resource for you. If you want more information about this, or you want to talk to us individually, we would love to have that conversation with you. You can get a hold of us on our website, seatstostreets.com. Love to have a conversation with you, or just send me an email at jr@seatstostreets.com, and we'd be able to have that conversation with you. What does it look like to come in to your setting, to see what your culture looks like, and to walk with you on changing this? We know that not everyone's an expert on understanding the language and using language, and identifying behaviors and modifying behaviors, and seeing the systems and putting in new systems, and then knowing the values and creating new values. We get that, but we get the opportunity to go to churches and to be able to see this in firsthand. So we'd love to offer that to you. Seatstostreets.com. Get a hold of us. We'd love to help you out. And coming up next week, we're going to take an even deeper dive into culture as we start to break this down and land this plane from 30,000 feet all the way down to ground level. So for Brian and I at Seats to Streets, we'll see you on the next episode. Take care.
Later.